My name is Jocelyn Alcala, and I am partnered with Alex Duarte and Vivian Harper Milan. Our topic for the panel research was psychology of athletic injury and recovery. So let's start with the basics. What is psychology of athletic injury and recovery? Psychology of athletic injury and recovery is the ability to recognize your own thoughts and readjusting your thinking in order to benefit yourself to come back sooner rather than prolonging your return to your sport. During your return to sport, you go through a process of healing which happens in many phases. So, why is an athlete's mental health so vital to recovery? Not only can it determine your recovery time, but it can also boost your motivation to get back and healthy back to your sport. An athlete's injury that keeps them out from playing for a long period of time can lead to trauma, depression, and many more. Being that two of us in this group have had two traumatic injuries that have required recovery time, we can vouch and say that mental health is definitely a big thing that needs to be taken serious when coming to return to play and your rehab.
Psychological effects of an injury on the athlete would consider re-injury anxiety, psychological distress, low self-esteem, fear of not healing back to the state it was. It is recommended to attend psychological interventions. Re-injury anxiety is one of the most common psychological reactions experienced by athletes. It is also one of the most common reasons why athletes do not return to the sport. It is found that athletes experiencing high re-injury anxiety report having low confidence in the ability to return to the sport. It also leads to low confidence and psychological distress is a depressive symptom following an injury. Depressive symptoms can vary based on the injury limits to mobility, length of rehabilitation, and delay in the athlete returning to the sport of physical activity. This depressive symptoms can arise soon after the injury, which could be associated with frustrations due to immobility, difficulties participating in everyday activities, and feelings of injustice and shock associated with the injury. Depressive symptoms can also have a delayed onset, could be associated with feeling socially isolated, loss of skills or opportunities, and overall absence for participating in training or competition, which can contribute to loss of athletic identity. Those athletes can require surgery following sports, may be more vulnerable to depressed mode than an athlete who has less severe sports injuries because of the delay returning to play. So for low self-esteem, it would just be more about people not feeling confident because they're injured and they depend on their sport as their identity, so they really don't feel confident in themselves to be able just to live life the way they have been because they can't do without their sport. The fear of not healing back to the state it was is just being scared, more fearful of getting re-injured and not trusting yourself. It's more of you having a good community foundation to help you keep that trust in yourself that you can get better in your sport, and your injury, your rehab can always be well. Yeah, you may have some bad days, but it will help you get to where you want to be, and you can return back to your sport sooner than you can. Recommended to attend psychological interventions is for medical professionals are aware of the psychological interventions which help athletes cope with the mental consequences of injury, including setting and adjusting goals during the rehabilitation process, and a measure paired with diaphragmatic breathing intended to induce relaxation. Goals can be defined as attaining a specific level of proficiency on a task, usually within a specified time period. For the pros and cons, motivation to rehab properly, getting back to playing, which would help the athlete just be better of staying on top of their rehab. That way they can get back on the field faster. Getting trust in their injury. It's just being confident in themselves to be able to trust their knee or their elbow, their shoulder, just anything what they're hurt for. The cons would be depression, just not feeling the way you should be. Low self-esteem would be the same thing as depression, just being able to go where you want and just lead yourself to be able to get back on track.
So for my article, I chose the role of psychological resilience in athletic injury, recovery, and performance. So in this study, they were trying to find if psychological resilience had an effect on athletic injury, recovery, and performance. By doing this, they did a study to explore and examine the part of the cerebral adaptability with athletic injury, recovery, and performance. Basically, they focused on the emotional and mental health side of things, being, all the way from when you were injured, your recovery process, your rehab, and how your post-performance was coming back when you returned to your sport. This study was basically used so that they would try to understand the influences of an athlete's recovery from injury and post-performance issues. And by doing this, they used a series of questions that were related to an independent and dependent variables. Our independent variables here were the psychological resilience on athletes, and the dependent variable being the injury, recovery, and performance. They ended up discovering that injury recovery plays a main role when coming back to your return to play. And at the end, the results showed 100% correlation between the psychological resilience and an athlete's recovery and performance. So basically, they also concluded that the independent and dependent variables played major roles in recovery and performance. Those who were resilient were able to handle the stress of an injury and recovery, so they came back better. Their mental health wasn't so tough for them. They had a lot of support. But those who struggled mentally were struggling to recover due to the fear of re-injury or poor performance. I can relate to this because being that I had ACL surgery, going to rehab wasn't very fun or exciting. I know I was always nervous when I would reach a new level of basically difficultness, because I was scared that I either couldn't do it or that I was going to re-injure myself because it wasn't very comfortable. But throughout my time of rehab, my physical therapist was very adamant about, asking him for help on my mental health and just talking to my parents about things. And I went to a lot of people for basically feedback, and I had a lot of people that were behind me and were pushing me to be better so that I could come back to return faster. So there's also psychological thoughts that affected these athletes differently depending on their mental health during their recovery and their injury here in this article. So one thing that I did find a pro in this article was a quote that said, "Athletes may optimize their recovery and performance results through competent medical treatment, attention to rehab, psychological support, diet, gradual return to sport, and continual monitoring and prevention." So again, like I said before, basically through the medical treatment, all of my doctors, all of my PTs, my athletic trainers were very nice and basically pushing me to get better. Even though they knew it was tough for me, they were there for me. They were there to tell me you got this, you can do it, you're just second guessing yourself. And another thing is attention to rehab. So my physical therapist was very attention to detail. So I had to pay very close attention to detail in my rehab process. And if I wasn't doing something right, he would come up to me right away and fix it. Psychological support, again, I did go to my school's therapist at my JUCO because I was just going through it mentally, being that I was at the fields. I wasn't able to practice. I just felt like I wasn't doing anything being there. I was just kind of being a burden on the team. But eventually when I came back through my recovery process and I was I still wasn't able to return to play, but I was still the loudest one on my team. I was always motivational to the other girls. And yeah. So then your gradual return to sport, I didn't try to rush this, but recovery time from my surgery, ACL surgery, was between 8 to 12 months. And I ended up coming back in 7.5 months because of the medical treatment, my attention to rehab, and my psychological support that I had. So I was able to return sooner than everybody else thought. And when I did return, my mom and my dad were very nervous about, letting me come back a lot earlier than, most athletes do. But they were there for me. They basically were my number one fans, rooting me on that I could do it and that they were so proud of me and everything. And continual monitoring and prevention was definitely a big thing because every day before and after practice, I would go to my athletic trainers. I'd do rehab before, or I'd do stretching and stuff, heating, stem before. That way my muscles were already kind of warmed up by the time I were to go to practice. And then after is when I went more for recovery, more icing, compression, and stuff like that. For the cons, I didn't think there was anything in this article that I didn't agree with. Again, as an athlete who has had a serious injury before, I think all points in this article did help when coming back to my sport. And mental health definitely can affect someone. So I would recommend, if you're going through an injury now or if you did before, I think everyone can at least say that, it wasn't easy, but they got through it with the help of others. So a little bit of a summary for my article is that injuries were a huge threat to all the athletes that were questioned, and it can affect their well-being, performance, and potentially their careers. Poor mental health can make someone quit their sport and lose the love for the game that they once loved because they think they can't do it again. They're afraid that when they come back, it's not going to be the same and they're not going to perform as well as they did before. There are a lot of emotional-based therapy sessions that you can go to for help with managing your emotions during rehab, and definitely recommend doing that. And I think a good quote that I found from this article was that people might perceive a stressful circumstance, such as an injury, as a challenge to conquer or a danger to their well-being. So I think going into this, when you get injured, you either have a perception of, I can do it, I'm going to conquer this challenge, or you can start off with poor mental health and just think I can't do it, this happened for a reason, I'm done, I'm quitting my sport. So it kind of just depends which way you see it and how you kind of take in your injury.
Okay, for this portion, we are going to break down the psychological effects that take place on an athlete during an injury and their recovery stage. This is just going to break it down into phases. So, before this study that we read about, it stated that athletic trainers have traditionally conceptualized rehabilitation programs in terms of 3 distinct phases. This would be in an acute injury phase, the repair phase, and then the remodeling phase. These phases before did not take into consideration any of the psychological effects that could take place on an athlete. This study breaks down the phases into 3 different parts. So the first part is going to be the worst part for an athlete, which is the reaction to the injury. So this is their initial feelings about being taken out of competition for their sport. So this could happen in a positive manner or in a negative manner, and this sets the tone for how the rest of the recovery stage is going to be. Phase 2 is the reaction to rehabilitation. So this would be their attitude towards recovery. This can also occur in 2 different manners. There's a positive way and a negative way. Some athletes take this as take their initial reaction, which could have been either positive or negative, and they could have turned it around and used the recovery stage as motivation to get better and to properly take care of their body in order to return to their sport. Or there's the opposite contradicting side, which would be the negative manner, where they don't want to participate in any of the recovery and rehabilitation because it's either too hard for them mentally or physically, and so they avoid this stage altogether. The third stage is the final stage, which is the reaction to returning to the sport, which is when the athlete would be getting cleared to play the sport again. And this is either in a positive or negative manner. Again, this is if the athlete wants to return to the sport, or sometimes they use this stage as a way to get out of the sport. Most of the time, this reaction is already predetermined by the reaction to the rehabilitation stage. Normally, athletes that react negatively during that stage don't do well when they start to return to their sport, and when they react positively to the rehabilitation stage, they're normally ready to go and very eager to return to their sport. Finally, it's just the breakdown of my personal pros and cons on the article that we selected. The pro that I have down for this article is that they consider the psychological effects, which I personally, as an athlete who has previously undergone such an injury, feel is very important to the healing process, meaning mental health will affect the physical health state as well. This is just stating that as a college athlete, you mostly see athletic trainers only asking questions about how you physically feel, not taking into consideration that you may have played this sport your entire life and have never gone through something like this. It could be very hard, especially at this age and after this long of playing. Some athletes need more guidance in the psychological phases rather than the physical. As for the cons, I wrote the psychological considerations are too deeply examined, as if the athletic trainers doing the examinations during rehab may not listen to the athlete because they may not believe the athlete when asking about their pain levels and etc. This is just stating, when I was reading about the article, it was saying that some of the athletic trainers may not believe their pain tolerance or their motivation or how they're describing their pain, or they feel that they're not doing enough or doing too little. I just feel that if you're going to ask about their feelings, their psychological feelings, then you should believe them, because how can you tell somebody how they do or do not feel? It's almost as if, why ask about their or why take them into consideration if you already have a predetermined answer. As for further thinking, we came up with 3 discussion questions regarding the psychological effects of the healing process in athletes. The first question is, if you have ever experienced an injury that took you out of competition for over 6 months, what was your thought process during the rehabilitation stages? This is just us wanting you guys to consider if you went through the phases and which route you took in the phases. Each phase had 2 routes that you could go. There was a more positive way and a more negative way, and we just want you to apply those phases to your own injury and tell us what you guys experienced. As for the second question, it says, do you think that if an athlete were to undergo a second severe injury, would they have the same thought process through the healing phase, or would it be worse or better this time? This is us just asking you what you would think an athlete would feel after they go through an injury that takes them out of their sport a second time, considering that the first time could never be easy. So would they react better the second time or worse? And the third question says, consider a professional athlete in this position. Do you think they go through a different healing process because of how much it can affect their career/lifestyle, as well as consider how they have access to better treatment? This is us just wanting you guys to consider like an NFL player or MLB player that possibly took them out of the sport so they no longer can play the season. This may affect their pay, their position on the field, or their position on the team and stuff like that. And would they come back and return just as well as they did before, or would it get worse? As well as the treatment access, this is us just making you guys think about how they have access to the best of the best when it comes to athletic trainers, maybe therapists, and better things that the average person would not have.
So for the conclusion, it'd be psychological effects are not taken into consideration enough when it comes to athletes' healing process. Although there are 3 phases, there are multiple outcomes for athletes' mental state. There are several outside factors that play a role in these effects. Psychological resilience had an effect on athletic injury, recovery, and performance. In fact, not 2 athletic injuries heal the same.